So good afternoon. Thanks for coming in on this gray day, since climate will be at least part of our discussion today. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Center, I'm Richard Gruisin. I direct the Center for 21st Century Studies. And let me also let you know that after the talk, we'll have a reception up on the 9th floor where you can map one of the Great Lakes, at least visually, since we've got a spectacular view of the lake from up there. So please join us afterwards as well to continue the conversation. It's a real pleasure to invite or to introduce Robert Markley and to have invited Bob here. He's been here for 2 days. Came in for a seminar yesterday with our Transdisciplinary Challenge fellows and spoke with them about some of the perils and possibilities of doing transdisciplinary research, and mostly about the project we'll be talking about today. And also this afternoon spoke with us in a brown bag, really interesting discussion about a piece on time, various sort of models of time and climate history through the Western literary tradition. And Bob's a really interesting figure whose works are extraordinarily, I think, diverse. He's trained in English literature. His main area of specialty is 18th century English literature, but he's been working on the relationships between literature and science for a long time, really for 25 years, 30 years, and has more recently begun to work on digital humanities projects, including the one he'll talk about today. Bob's the author of 4 monographs, most recently Far East in the English Imagination, but also a book on Mars in Science and the Imagination called Dying Planet, and 2 other 18th century books as well. He's edited 3 books. He's edited a dozen issues of journals, special issues of journals, and has published more than 80 articles and chapters. He's currently professor, the W.D. and Sarah E. Trowbridge Professor of English at the University of Illinois and editor of the 18th Century Theory and Interpretation. Been doing that for also quite a long time. Anyway, with that, no further ado. Happy to give Bob.
And I have figured out we've known each other for about 25 years. And he points out that I was on the interview team for his first tenure track job at another institution many years ago. It's particularly gratifying to be able to talk about a collaborative project, which I think has some kind of general applications to how we think about the humanities interacting with other disciplines. I'm wondering if we could, if you'd all mind, if we could cut the lights, since I've got a lot of color in these slides and it'll distract from my talk if you're looking at pretty pictures. If I'm in anyone's way, please let me know. I'll talk a little bit about the collaboration in a bit, and I want to emphasize that some of these interpretations are mine rather than my collaborators, and I'm happy to discuss that collaborative process. I just wanted to give you an overview of the collaboration on what we call the Great Lakes Project. It started off with a Digging Into Data grant, which was jointly funded by NEH and the National Science Foundation. We did a pilot project with 40 maps, and I'll talk about the ball segmentation algorithm. I keep trying to fix this in, and it never seems to want to fix. So, yeah, I was going to say, well, the bigger box, and then it reverts for some reason. Last year, I was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Computing Applications and Technologies at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where I actually worked with a computer scientist, and we enlarged our data set and used it, I'll explain it briefly, as superpixel analysis. This was the initial grant. It was very complicated. We had $300,000, which in scientific circles amounts to pretty much loose change that you've found in the couch. We worked with a variety of partners. There are a couple articles that came out of it about the process of collaboration. You can find out about this on the Digging Into Data website through NEH. I was an investigator 1/3 of the project, and I worked with Peter Bashi, who left NCSA for NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and Michael Simeoni, who was a former PhD student of mine and who has since gone on as of the beginning of this week to be Director of Digital Humanities at Arizona State. So what we did with these 40 maps is set up a pilot project that we then pursued in the ICAT fellowship. We now have a much larger data set. We wanted to develop tools, and I think this is the important point, to analyze irregular shapes to denote similarities and differences computationally. And this is where the humanities cross over into the sciences. We wanted to find things that we could not examine with the naked eye that would be of interest to historians, environmental historians, cartographers, climatologists in this early modern period. This was the 5 of us who worked on this aspect of the project. Kent McHenry is the computer scientist. ISDA stands for Image and Spatial Data Analysis, which is a group at NCSA, which is concerned with visualization. Let me go on to the next slide and I'll explain as I go along. The question became, why the Great Lakes? Well, first of all, the Great Lakes are an unusual body of water. Geologically, they've appeared in the blink of a geological eye within the last 10 or 11,000 years. Largest chain of freshwater lakes in the world. And it turns out that they're very hard to account for in climate modeling for the whole region. Their watershed is comparatively small. Most of their water levels have to do with precipitation rather than runoff. In climate history, in climate modeling, it turns out that one of the problems is that we have practically no direct, other than proxy data, before 1850 to measure climate temperatures in North America, or measure temperatures and precipitation in North America. I presume you all know what proxy data are. They're surprisingly, proxy data? Okay. Ice cores, tree rings, pollen samples, bog sediments. There are about 5 or 6 different main sites in southern Ontario, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, and Wisconsin. No, there are actually about 8 sites now that I think of it, where you can put together a pretty good sense of regional climate with a fairly broad stroke. So in many of the current climate models, within the same unit, the same square unit, Chicago and Milwaukee are together. Chicago at the bottom of the square, Milwaukee at the top of the square. So one of the things that climate modelers are trying to do is get smaller and smaller regions to analyze to fine-tune their analysis. Because as we all know, if you're a farmer growing crops or you're worried about snow removal on the roads, the difference between Chicago and Milwaukee can be significant, or the difference in any 70-mile region can be quite significant. Water levels, and this is why we centered in on Huron and Michigan, vary in 30 to 40-year cycles. We know that. They seem to vary in 160-year cycles. But in turn, we don't know what the effects of climate change are going to be on water levels in the lake. The water levels in the lake, along with ice cover, change radically what happens to climate predictions looking out 30 and 40 and 50 years for the region. And ice cover, as you know, varies significantly from year to year. And so our working hypothesis has been that these maps actually encode forms of knowledge. So for these early maps that I'll be talking about today, French explorers, the Great Lakes were almost exclusively French territory into the middle of the 18th century, British traders and accounts. Map makers at times seem to be integrating multiple sources, multiple expeditions. And these maps, as I'll point out, come with graticule and scale bars that indicate cartographers' efforts to provide precise locations, which were economically very important. Later on, as we'll see, there are longitude and latitude lines on map. And climatological conditions that shift over time may produce the seemingly erratic representations of coastlines and islands. So if you looked at the 300 maps in our collections, they wouldn't make any sense in terms of a notion of scientific progress or progress in mapping from year to year. The maps do not get quote unquote better, if we mean better in terms of more accurate by our standards today. And so this idea that the maps were varying randomly seemed to us plausible but less interesting, that cartographers were actually trying to record the latest updated information about the coastlines. There are all sorts of epistemological problems with determining, as we'll see, what a coastline is and how you measure it. So these are the natural water fluctuations in Michigan, Huron. The 160-year fluctuation shows here the 30-year fluctuation. The measured upper limit of where the lakes are and the inferred lower limit, meters, feet. So that you can see, and these are thousands of years ago, this is 1950. And so you can see on, with these lines that are closely packed together here, that the variations in the lakes within, say, my lifetime have been significant. This is this is from the NOAA, the Great Lakes Research Lab. And you can see that in meters or in feet, significant variation. This ends in 210. This summer, lake levels in Georgian Bay dropped to all-time lows, which I'll talk about in a moment. But as you can see over, this kind of historical record, there's a fairly significant difference in what the lake levels are. Here's why everybody in Ontario is very excited. This is the same site in Georgian Bay. This little girl here is sitting on the same rock 19 years later. Now, I don't know if you can quite see this, but his foot is actually dangling in the water on that rock. And so within this young woman's lifetime, you can see that the water level where her grandfather is holding her here is now somewhere out there. And you'll notice that somebody had to build a dock out to get their boat. And as you can see, as the water has retreated, vegetation has taken over fairly quickly. And if you were to map the lake today, this would be, marked as land. Whereas, here you're pulling a boat in and you can see the water extends behind them. This is the Manitoulin Island, which I'll be talking about in the South Shore. And you can see that here we get at the epistemological problem of what constitutes land and what constitutes a coastline. Water, as you know, in the lakes can get pushed up over land. Clearly, at some point, we would have considered this the coastline. You can see that in effect, this rock is relatively dry up in here. The coast changes. And so, this rock you may have been able to bring a boat over, a canoe or a rowboat or a small powered craft 30 years ago, you can't do it now. So the question is, what kind of knowledge do maps reflect about the coastline? We're at the infancy, in some ways, of understanding Great Lakes hydrology. There's the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, which is hurting for funding as part of NOAA, given politics in Washington. The International Association for Great Lakes Research, which published the Journal of Great Lakes Research, and public advocacy groups. And if you want a kind of introduction to the concern in Southern Ontario, you can go to stopthedrop.ca, which includes both serious scientists and also people on kind of the fringe who are accusing the Canadian government of siphoning water off the Great Lakes and shipping it to China, which wouldn't be particularly lucrative, but that charge is out there. This is a NOAA map of the water depth in the Great Lakes. We're going to be focusing, our research has singled out the Bruce Peninsula here, Manitoulin Island here as kind of key areas. And there's a fairly steep drop off in water. This is measured in meters, so even though it looks shallower here than out in the middle of the lake, it's still fairly deep, and that's one of the reasons why the outlines of Manitoulin Island become so important to us. 1989, if any of you remember, was a cold winter here. And on April 10th, which is well into the spring, this is the extent of ice cover. And I believe the standards for ice cover are no open patches of water. Historically, this passage, they call it the North Passage, north of Manitoulin Island, was the canoe route that French traders took to get from Montreal, I'll show you this on a map in a minute, down the French River. They'd enter Georgian Bay around here and have to make it out to Lake Winnipeg and back in a fairly compressed period of time. But you can see that as late as 1989, with a cold winter, the northern lobe of Lake Huron is pretty well iced in, and even the areas that are, we would consider more open water, have significant ice cover there. This is a satellite photo from NOAA of a different winter, and you can see some clouds, but this is actually, you can see Manitoulin Island has kind of disappeared under ice and snow cover. What we'll be talking about is the representation of Manitoulin Island. You can see it very well here. It's the longest freshwater island in the world. It's cut by a number of bays, but this is about, well, to the end of Coburn Island there, it's about 100 miles, or almost 100 miles. And this is an island that has to be mapped because you're canoeing through here. You're coming down this way, and speed is of the essence. As you can see from that chart, if the lake is iced over on April 10th and you're a fur trader, you do not want to be dragging your canoe over ice for a long period of time. So if you found those conditions, you might have to leave on April 15th or 18th. If you didn't make it back to Montreal, or at least onto the river, onto the French River by early November, you spent the winter on the lakes, and either starved or at the very least did not get paid because you had nothing, you had only furs to exist on. Now, when we were doing the NSF NEH grant, the Digging and Data grant, what we came up with, or what the graduate student we were working with, and they've written about it here, came up with is a ball segmentation algorithm. And what that does is basically send a little bouncing ball in between lines hundreds of thousands of times and produces a cutout. And this is what we used for the first step. This is one of the regression analyses we ran on Lake Ontario between French maps and British maps. And you can see that there's a gradual, this is the square mileage of the lakes. We are measuring area in a very rough fashion. And you can see that the regression analysis produces this kind of clustering after a certain point. We do have new visualizations, which will be in the next version of this PowerPoint at some point. These are relative, not absolute values of accuracy. We were dissatisfied with that for a number of reasons, the labor involved, the kind of crudeness, and so what we did in the recent grant is develop a superpixel analysis and segmentation using centroid distance function. There'll be a test on this after I'm through talking. These are the sources that Deepak discovered. This was part of his PhD work. This is the equation for centroid distance function. The only thing you have to understand is it's a useful mathematical tool because the simple layperson's explanation, which is about all I can handle, is it's kind of like an ellipse and you're measuring from 2 points, 2 centroid points. So this makes it invariant to translation, which means that scalar differences are less important in determining shape and segmentation. So what these allow us to do is identify meaningfully discrete regions with finer grain distinctions. They adjust parameters so they can do fine-grained analysis of pixels that quote unquote look alike into superpixels. Better shape identification, and it allows, sorry for this down there, allows for future analyses of specific regions such as bays, inlets, and islands. So this is a run. This is actually an app we use which is not quite automated yet. I'm calling it rather than superpixel segmentation for irregular shapes, I call it the old map app. But as you can see, and it's picking up various borders here, lines on the map, it actually segments and then color codes in ways that will prove useful in other kinds of projects. So what a computer scientist wants to do is find general equations that can do things along all maps, rather than something that's specific to these maps. Okay, so what does this mean in real terms? Let me come back here so I'm not standing in anyone's way. Whoops, let me do that. So these are 2 different maps. These are screenshots from an article that Deepak is working on, okay, about 1800. You can tell Canada West and Upper Canada in what is now New York State. These are basically 2 runs of the same test data. And you can see that they're the same image, right? So in other words, the superpixel analysis is producing the same image in 2 different runs. This is what you want if you're, reproducibility. You can then color code the exact matches. Again, we're looking at 2 different runs. So you can see this part of Huron, even the state of Pennsylvania, are identical. This is superpixel images analysis of the 2 different maps that we saw before. And you can see the color coding and the shapes are different. So the different maps produce this different modes of segmentation, which are called region borders. And as you can see, you can write code that will instruct you to analyze different shapes. And you can see that the code is, as I like to say, content agnostic. It's finding lines on the map, it's defining regions. It doesn't matter whether it's a lake or not. So you have to teach it it's a lake. The reduced color intensity produces a degree of match in the second image. So in other words, by choosing this image, you can see this has been selected here. It gives you, in terms of color intensity, a kind of ability to match that in some sort of way. Everybody follow that? And it's measuring the square mileage of the whole lake. What we will be able to do in the future is measure just a small segment. So if we're worried about the representation of a single bay or a single island, we will be able to measure that by setting parameters. Okay. This is where humanists come in. Manitoulin Island, which is spelled in various ways at the time. French map is 1685. This is the island that lies just south of the route of French fur traders. Monet's map, 1685. Most of these maps, by the way, are named after the Jesuits who were exploring or opening missions in the area. They're not necessarily the engravers. 1685. This is the famous Gallinet map of 1670. We're going to pay close attention to this. Gallinet was the first Jesuit expedition to come through Lake Erie and up this coast, up the Bruce Peninsula, and across the south shore of Manitoulin Island, which is important. You can see, if you look at a map today, he knows a lot about this region. This is just, guesswork over here. But that's how you make a map when you're charting it from a canoe or from a ship. Okay. I want you to pay particular attention to the south shore of Manitoulin Island. Now, there are two kinds of artistic conventions we have to keep in mind here. These lines that look like lines on a topographical map are not there for decoration. There's some attempt to indicate water depth. Although, as a friend of mine in French studies points out, the French being French, the lines are going to be as symmetrical as possible. But what they're indicating is where the water gets deep and where it's shallow. Gallinet, unlike most of the others, came along the south shore here. This is the Gallinet map against the 1965 navigation chart. By 1865, and if we had more time and you wanted to look at even more slides, you would see that the navigation charts, and most of you know about navigation charts, depths are recorded in the light blue area in fathoms and in the dark blue area in feet. If you looked at navigation charts from 1865, they look exactly the same as the navigation charts from 1965, and that is because navigation charts of the Great Lakes do not show varying water levels. And if you get a navigation chart to go sailing on Huron or Michigan, there are warnings that say, watch out for rocks, because rocks that don't appear on here are actually there, and vice versa. And you get into real interesting questions about whether rock outcroppings count as islands or not. Now, this is interesting. You can tell that Gallinet and I forget which tribe he was canoeing with. You can see that actually as you look at it, if you begin looking island by island, the south shores of the island are pretty well rendered. This is hard to see. I wish the image were bigger, but if you look at this area right around here on the southeastern Coburn Island, you can see that there are a lot of rocks in the water there. And you can see that it's light blue. Depth is being measured in feet rather than out here in fathoms. And so Gallinet's map has this as a solid piece of land, which strikes me as kind of interesting. Is he saying water with discrete rock outcroppings, or is he saying the kind of uncovered land we saw that little girl sitting on 19 years apart, where this appears close enough to solid land? If you move along the south shore of Manitoulin Island itself, you can see that there's a fairly accurate rendering of these, very complicated inlets and islands and so on. The north shore he's guessing, you know, or he's using information from others. And so you can see within the same map, there's a kind of local knowledge, experiential knowledge encoded, and up here, secondhand knowledge of whatever sort. Now, starting with 1685, the Franklin map, Manitoulin Island, and this is a very interesting map for a couple reasons. Manitoulin Island tends to be produced as one long island with a chain of islands that stretch to the west. The locals up here on Georgian Bay refer to this region as the Million Islands. And you can see that not only is Manitoulin a long unbroken island, but there has been a kind of good faith effort here within the limitations of engraving technologies in 1685 to render this incredible complexity of, you know, rock outcroppings and small islands along the coast. All right. I should also emphasize, for those of you who are historians, map making is an expensive art. Map making is also, from a business standpoint, highly competitive. And as you can see, these have to be carved by hand. They have to be set. They have to be hand colored. This is an elaborate piece of work. The way that you sell maps in the late 17th century is by saying, my map is newer and more accurate than the map you bought last year. So you can see if you bought a copy of Gallinet's map, you can see that the Franklin map, or the ones producing it, are going to argue this is a better map. All right? Oh, I've got to get the latest map if I'm going to invest in Canada, if I'm going to go to Canada. And you can see very clearly here what becomes significant is the canoe route, the French River there, and this is how you get through. Okay, long unbroken island. What's interesting, and here's the satellite image we looked at before. This is the Grevelo map of 1746. And what's interesting is you can see that the shape of both the Bruce Peninsula, here and here, changes. The whole shape of Lake Huron is rendered, you know, in radically different ways. This one is, quote unquote, more accurate than this one. But Manitoulin Island, you know, looks relatively the same. Now, if you look at this satellite image and you think about the difficulties of making a map of an island when you have no, you know, kind of bird's eye view of it, just by sailing in a canoe, you can see that based on Franklin's journals and sketches, this is pretty damn good. I mean, you know, we want to look at this as an aesthetic object. We want to, you know, make fun of it because it's got all these things wrong about down here. But boy, I'll tell you, when he's actually paddling along the island, this is not bad. Better than we could do. Here you can see there's a more stylized rendering, but you can tell what the map maker is interested in here and what the French are interested in, rivers. Okay, not only what tribes are in the area, rivers, because rivers you can navigate, you can get up, get supplies, meet people, and so on. The Hennepin map of 1701. Again, this is, you know, pretty good compared to what we, quote unquote, know the lake to be. But notice that the Bruce Peninsula strikes Hennepin as a very accurate journal. You know, he was the Jesuit who traveled out there, very accurate. You notice that the Bruce Peninsula has become, here it's rendered as a single body of land. Here it's rendered as a single body of land. What's Hennepin thinking? Okay, just to change things up, we're going to represent this as a series of islands, or are we actually talking about epistemological problems and not only water levels? Is this a place where people say you can drag your canoes overland on ice. The land here is low-lying, not particularly low-lying. And is it bad information? Well, this is a fairly, well-known area by this time. To go back to that earlier image we saw, the South Shore with the rocks, where does the land end and where does the water begin? It's a kind of Mandelbrot question. How long is the coastline of Bruce Peninsula rather than England? A century later, and in the Russell map, Manitoulin Island has become a chain of isles. Now, there are various ways of reading this, and as you'll see, different map maker, Manitoulin is the same chain of 8 islands. Manitoulin in 1804. Now notice the maps are completely different as to how they represent Lake Huron. And also, Whittle is interested in the tribes in the areas. He knows where, forts are. But this looks much less like Lake Huron than Wilkinson in 1804. Now, what this, I think, demonstrates pretty conclusively as you look at enough of these samples, people are not simply copying each other. They're re-engraving the maps. Manitoulin is still this chain of 8 islands. Alexander Henry, this was published in New York in 1809, but talking about 1760 and 1776. This is the lands everywhere along the north shore of Lake Huron from the island of La Cloche are poor, with the exception of those of the island of Manitoulin, 100 miles in length, where they are generally good. The Isle Manitoulin was formerly so described. This is a note to his 1770s journal, okay? It is now known that there is no island in Lake Huron of 100 miles in length, and that the Manitoulin are a chain of islands. Now, what's interesting here, there are 2 things that are interesting about that entry. If we go back and look at a satellite image, you can see out here that indeed there's Coburn Island, there's another island. One could indeed think of Manitoulin as this chain of islands, which everyone seems to know. But by the early 19th century, you can see that people are representing, and this is the border, of course, between the United States and Canada, are representing waterways through the middle of the island. Same thing here, chain of 8 islands. Wilkinson, chain of 8 islands. It is now known that there is no island in Lake Huron of 100 miles in length, and that the Manitoulin are a chain of islands. Now, this is early 19th century map making. Tardieu is actually working in England. You can see it's in English. Longitude, latitude. We'll look at a close-up of Manitoulin in a moment. Okay. Well, here's the indication of water depths. This is a detail. The environmental historian I work with, Chris Morris, and I talked about this a lot a few weeks ago. In some ways, this is a more accurate representation of bays and inlets that we see on the long Manitoulin Island today. And Chris, by the way, is from Ontario and has a summer house right about here where the chalkboard is, or his family does. Academics have family summer houses, not their own summer houses, as you probably know. I see this, I've done a fair amount of canoeing. Who's ever doing this map is telling the cartographer, you don't have a portage here, you can get through. That seems to me the key thing. Has anybody ever done a portage with a canoe? Okay. Those of you who've done it, it's not an experience you're likely to forget if you're portaging a canoe for a couple miles, and especially at this time, although the fur trade is changing, over rocks with these heavy, heavy loads. Heavy boats, these boats the canoes actually had up to 14 people in them. So there are big things, and even if you have eight or nine people carrying them, it's a royal pain in the butt. And so at least what this map indicates on a kind of experiential level is you can either drag the canoe over ice or you can get through here. That these are a chain of islands. So the $64,000 question is, do these tell us anything about lake levels and ice cover in Lake Huron? Ice cover becomes important because you can drag a canoe over ice, depending on the depth of the ice. This is Aerosmith in 1814. If Jane Austen has a geography in her house, it's Aerosmith. Let's look at a detail. There's the detail of Manitoulin Islands. 8 islands. Obviously, nobody has said since 1801, hey, these previous idiots got it wrong. It's one long island, but you can see a chain of islands. What interests me is this one. It's an 1819 Aerosmith, after the so-called year without a summer, when after the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, you had a global cooling of the climate, and then the melt-off from heavy snows. You compare these two maps published by the same cartographer, and you can see that this has been, not only is the spelling different, the islands have been re-engraved, okay? Just look at these, for example. Okay, the general shapes are the same, more irregular. What's presented as a solid island here is now, there are these two tiny islands in between, but it's still this chain of islands. 1819, we're almost at the age, we're getting close to the age of steamship travel on the lakes, which is radically going to change understandings of the hydrology. So where are we? Right now, we're in the process of putting more maps into our database. We think that higher lake levels and ice cover alters the coastlines of Huron dynamically on short and long-term timescales. So there's a climatological element here. Over time, are lake levels dropping or rising? But there's also that remember the 30-year cycle and that 160-year cycle? You suddenly have a really complicated partial differential equation. But the maps seem to indicate that people are aware that the coastlines are dynamic, and these maps have to be corrected. In terms of, and when we talk about geological effects, what are represented on the maps? The sense of an island as a single island or as a chain of islands. And these complex cycles of water levels, I think, radically alter the ways in which we experience and perceive the lakes. And I think that what we're close to demonstrating for the climate change people we're working with, you can actually begin to talk about data from pre-1815 maps, or at least make better and more accurate guesses about the data as rather than just norming values for a century or 2 centuries beforehand. Well, okay, this is the ongoing collaboration, and I think this is what sort of interests me as somebody in the humanities. No one person is going to be able to figure out everything that's going on here. My contribution is, I was actually the one who was staring at these maps and noticing that Manitoulin Island, that there was actually a pattern there, that and it sounds simple. I mean, there's no intellection on my part, I'll freely admit. But the digital humanities allows us to look at hundreds of digitized maps all at once, to do comparisons. On Thursday morning, yesterday morning, I went up to the map library here, which is phenomenal, and got a quick tour of Great Lakes maps, and it's great. In any rare book room in a map library, there are only so many maps you can spread out at one time before you run out of table space. Or people think that you're, planning some kind of heist of maps of Lake Hurons. So the digital aspect of it has become extremely important because we can do interpretive comparisons. And I showed the maps of Manitoulin to Don Wubbles, who's head of one of our climate change groups at Illinois, and his eyes practically bugged out of his head because they know, for climate modeling purpose, that lake levels vary. But if you show kind of consistent, what may be ice cover or high water levels, that actually affects what your climate model shows and affects the agriculture of the entire Midwest. So on that level, the ability to look at this in a digital format and do comparisons, I think is critical. Chris Morris at Texas Arlington, an environmental historian, he just published a book with Oxford called The Big Muddy, which, and the subtitle is A 500-Year Environmental History of the Mississippi River. He's one of the few environmental historians who works on water and hydrology, and he has his own set of interpretive skills to bring on this. He was the one who pointed out to me, my initial assumption was, got to be a lot of wetlands that are, flooding, and he said, he grew up on the lake. It's all granite, and he has, if we had more time for more slides, you would see granite outcroppings. And you could debate endlessly from an ecological or philosophical point of view whether these need to be represented as water or land in terms of the lakes. Michael Simeone, who's now the Director of Digital Humanities and Data Analysis, is the one working on visualization, although he was trained in English, and he's been invaluable in gluing this all together. He actually is the one who speaks both computerese and humanists, so he can talk to. Kent McHenry is a research scientist at NCSA in the image and spatial analysis, that should be spatial and data analysis group. He has an $11 million grant from the NSF, which we're going to be part of, on data visualization and what you do with data. So he's interested in extracting data, because this is all engraved rather than printed data, from maps. And I think it's a good object lesson in what collaboration actually means. We're actually working on, we've got different parts of the same elephant in grasp, but he finds this interesting for the computer science problems it poses and how we can extract data. And it's his graduate students like Deepak who've been working with us on the superpixel analysis, because the more information we can extract, the happier the computer scientists are. When I was writing the ICAT fellowship application a couple of years ago, Kenton's concern was, you got to run more cycles, more supercomputing cycles. So that's when we came up with the boxing small areas, which is the next step in this in terms of analysis of individual bays or Bruce Peninsula, parts of Manitoulin Island. We then realized if we're thinking ecologically, we need someone to think about what the effects of rising and falling lake levels are. If you look at the Journal of Great Lakes Research, much of it is biological, about algae blooms, about microorganisms, about fish populations. Nigel came in and asked about, and said he was reading about wolves on Isle Royale. And Lucinda Cole at Southern Maine is a specialist in animal studies. The map project got so big that one of my graduate students who works in 18th century studies has basically taken over the curating of these digital archives, because somebody has to know where the maps are and to provide us with data on each of the individual maps. There is a referee digital series at the University of Pennsylvania Press for Mariner 10, and we're going to submit this, or submit a first version of this as a referee digital publication in addition to grants. At this stage, this started off as a DVD series, a DVD-ROM series. Now it's, the new titles are iPad apps. So, whenever we get this done, which of course depends on funding, you'll be able to do map analyses of various bays and so on throughout the Great Lakes regions. So that's what I have. Hi, Joe.
Well, you brought up the elephant, and so I'm going to ask a question about an elephant. And since we have an Africanist in the room, for Bruce, I'll ask this too.
Okay.
There's a kind of famous mapping expedition in Western Africa in the middle of the 19th century by the British, and they did these topographical maps. And there's a famous elephant in a map that's a part of topography.
Right.
And it persists for decades
Yes.
and decades and decades.
Yes.
And the beginning of it was just these two guys who were drunk and didn't want to finish the maps. They
Right.
just did their line of an elephant and walked away.
Right.
And so this ended up being in these maps for military maps for such a long time. And this is the problem for me around this kind of digital humanities
Right.
thing, is that the sort of humanistic side gets flattened out, where everything, like all the maps, I know you don't do this, but the tendency is to see all maps as the same, right? They're all just data points
Right.
that one loses the whole metadata behind the map, right?
Yes.
And so where is the balance of that? And does this actually just ruin it, right? Because without the story of the two guys who just got bored,
Right.
and didn't want to finish their map, you don't really know anything, right? So so that's my question.
Okay. Well, I think that they're
My problem with the digital humanities. How's
Okay.
that? Okay.
All right. There are two answers here. One is all of the Midwestern states have these state historical archives. You hear about them, and you know, my eyes are rolling back in my head. They have complete, often bad, translations, but they're now digitizing good translations of every single French expedition that kept a journal anywhere through the Great Lakes region. So that we have these, and I mean, they run to hundreds of volumes, and it's day-by-day journal keeping by Jesuits who were trained to keep day-by-day journals. They're phenomenal historical resources. So we actually know where people were going and why they were going. And the quote-unquote data points that I'm using are mixed in with all this complex anthropological, meteorological, economic, providentialist narratives, which are one reason I want to, I wanted to be a historian on this project. The second point is there's an economic imperative here, which is the fur trade, and which has, and from an animal studies point, very early on the French have to make it beyond Lake Superior, over to Lake Winnipeg, because they've hunted everything. Yeah, because they're decimating populations of animals, or the tribes they're buying from, basically, are decimating animal populations. So I think that one of the things that we're trying to get at here is a kind of complex picture, which is why we're going with this DVD format. The problem is doing the translation work to get the funding through computer science to do this. And the simple fact of the matter, if any of you are scientists, if you say digital information design, visualization, there's money. If you say climate change, everybody gets nervous for a couple of reasons. First of all, climate modeling requires massive amounts of computer time and money, so they're big grants. Secondly, there's all sorts of political blowback in terms of climate funding. I understand that some of you are not thrilled with your current governor in Wisconsin in that regard. So I think that one of the things is that I think I have to bring to the table is I have to sit down and talk to Kenton about what we want and what he can do. So originally the idea of, when I was first working on this digging in the data grid, the idea of measuring square miles of the Great Lakes and kind of,
you know, it seemed not exactly pointless, but it seemed like we were trying to, you know, do brain surgery with a pickaxe. I mean, in terms of what we were doing. But as we developed this technology, as we got to this superpixel centroid function, which was, I showed you a couple of references. It was out there in the literature. Nobody had done anything with it. We now have a way, which the computer scientists are interested in, to measure coastlines, to measure irregular shapes, which is a problem. What's really interesting is in the next stage, we can, you know, you can, if you're doing an analysis, you can single out this area here. You can draw a box just around that point right there and measure it in that way and get more and more fine-grained analysis. I will say that one of the problems here with the digital is we're reducing the size of the maps. We have various sizes of maps. And some of these are big, elaborate, you know, sorts of things. And actually thinking about the engraving technologies that you have to use, not only to get these points, but to get this shading, is really kind of complicated. The final thing I'll say about that aspect of it is I've been introduced to the map collecting community, which thinks about these solely in art historical terms, or in very trivial historical terms. Oh, you know, this Gravelo, he was a drunk, you know, and you know, had 3 illegitimate kids, and oh, that map, that was done when Little was going through a divorce, you know, these kinds of things. So I think that it's the ability to try to bring everybody together. And it doesn't mean you're great. I mean, if I say in the humanities, we're going to get together and have a seminar, we want to reach some kind of, you know, consensus. In the sciences, you often don't even meet your collaborators. You know, you find your name. There are a couple articles now that I'm like the 7th author on in digital humanities. I haven't even met, you know, some of the people, and I couldn't pick them out of a police lineup, although I might have talked to them on Skype once. So it's finding those common kind of grounds and then doing something that you would find interesting as part of this project.
I taught history of cartography for 25
wow.
years out of the collection, and I'm a historian. And I just wish I were 50 years younger so that I could come to a doctorate with you.
Yeah.
But I wanted to mention some very basic points that I'm concerned with in the process of translating.
Right.
First of all, I found points to be very differently represented from lines to be very differently represented from areas.
Yes.
And I think you have to keep this in mind
Yes.
at all times, because once you begin to be able to estimate the longitudes and know the latitudes, it kind of complicates it. So you have to keep up with the changes in the technology of locating things spatially.
Right.
And then there's the question of representation. It occurs to me that you go from the sketches that were made by the native peoples, the sketches that were made by the Jesuits, and then various forms of representation. And I don't think you want to go very far into the 19th century, because you wind up with lithographs rather than offering engravings.
Right.
And so this seems to be constrained by the period of the technology of copper engravings, because they said even the 16th century, an engraver could only do the amount of area under his thumb in a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just hope that you look at the changes in medium.
Yes, that's a great point. What we've been doing is we had a problem initially because we have to find maps that are digitized at a certain DPI that are accurate enough. And what we can do now is measure down to the level of the pixel, which is pretty good. David Rumsey, you must be familiar, out in California.
Collection online.
Online. And we actually talked to him, he said use anything. But he also said, let me know which maps could be digitized better. The climate scientists are the ones who are driving the 1850 date, despite the changes in technology, because that's where they don't have data. Great Lakes data gets much better right after the Civil War. So, and I had similar kinds of questions about technologies of representation, which we're going to have to deal with. One of the interesting things about the changing technologies is the French did not include chronological, what's the thing for measuring longitude called? They call it the chronological in French. They didn't carry these on boats they never carried them on boats in the Great
Well,
Lakes.
the Brits were the first ones
Yeah.
to do it in the
Right.
1770s.
Yeah, 1770s. So the French are still mapping lakes with I think longitude.
Yes, reckoning sort of
Yeah.
things.
Right, dropping logs in the water and seeing how far you're going and how long it takes you to go the length of the log. So I think all these questions are critical ones that we're dealing with. Once you have steamships, you can go anywhere on the lakes. One of the problems is if you're in a canoe out on the Great Lakes, you have to be very careful about weather. And that, it's shocking how few people would take a canoe out into, Georgian Bay, for example, up here. You'd stuck as close to the shore as you possibly could. And you can actually see sketches that the Jesuits are drawing. They did have mathematical training of, distance between points, which is basis for the map, but I think all your points are really.
One last question on that is because you know from studying 18th century England that meteorological data begins to come in and you get notions of altitude
Yes.
and of rainfall.
Right.
When does this begin? When does it kick in the Great Lakes?
That's a great question. The Great Lakes are sparsely populated. I mean, all of New France in the 1750s is less than 100,000 people. So what you have are you don't really have, like you do in England, what we now call a rain gauge network. You have, these outposts separated by vast distances, and the French were much more intrepid than the British. I mean, if you look at the history of North America, the British were still basically confined within 100 miles of the coast 200 years after they landed. The French were all over the place. The French actually sent an expedition from Michilimackinac up here that canoed in one summer to South Carolina to open up, to sell their furs. I mean, it's mind-boggling. They essentially were a riverine culture. New Orleans was being fed in the early 18th century by grains and grown in what is now southern Illinois. They'd trek it down the Mississippi River, then they'd have to drag the boats back up. There was a 3-month difference in time. So the data we get from the French is great locally, and it's diversity, but there are no regular settlements along much of the lakes at that time, at least of Europeans who are keeping records. In terms of the indigenous maps, some of which we've looked at, they're great. I mean, if somebody asks you, draw a map of how I get from here to Chicago, you're not going to start drawing, the coast of the lake and over here and 50 miles over. You can draw a straight line. And that what you get in the indigenous maps that we have in there very few are perfect directions that you would, ask, where do I turn left, where do I turn right, do I stay close to the shore? And, it's the Jesuits who are obsessed with mapping. There's some great Jesuit hand-sketched maps. So, hope that answers your question. Yeah. Sorry.
I think the questions so far and the discussions have been really great, and I think the issue of the metadata was a really good point. And I just wanted to say that the challenge is that the questions of metadata are present even with contemporary mapping or satellite imagery or anything. Two examples, for instance, a very common problem is a mixed pixel problem, which is in identifying the boundaries between water and vegetation. So when I teach GIS, that's a problem I often tell the students, that how are you going to categorize? There are different methods of that. The problem is that the record is not kept often in the metadata. How were the boundaries drawn? And so that's a perfect case of how these things are lost, even in contemporary remote sensing, land use, land cover analysis. Another great example is the study that was showing, with land use, land cover analysis of vegetation, that what appeared to be reforestation, successful reforestation, except that in satellite image analysis you classify, right? I mean, you see the categories of data, and then you classify what is what. And it's up to the person who's classifying, or the group of researchers, or the institute. Now, in this particular example, the reforestation effort that was lauded as success was categorized by the government-led project and the scientists, except the local experiential knowledge showed that the coverage that was being classified as forest cover was not forest cover. It's never been considered forest cover. And it's been reinterpreted as forest cover for official purposes. So I mean, I think that this is a very interesting, examples, but these are problems that are rife even today. And I think this is sort of like in defense of, it's really hard to tell through metadata today, through examples of land use, land cover analysis, or even just, which should be like, when one looks at a satellite image, one thinks, oh, this is perfect, but that fact is that satellite image itself can have lots of issues too, and that more recent technology does not necessarily mean that it's error-free.
Right. I think that's a great point. When we started doing this project, there's a kind of scientific version of Academia EDU called ResearchGate. We made contact with a group which is working on, an EU group, which is working on reforestation in Poland. And there have apparently been pitched battles about what constitutes reforestation. And counterintuitively, reforestation is bad because it means less land is being farmed in a predominantly agricultural setting, and that the nutritional intake for people is going down. But pitched battles over what you're actually seeing with, quote unquote, scientific data, objective data. It's a slammed water problem, in different concerns. So that's great. Thanks.
Just as an example, cite the 1836 map of Milwaukee, which you may or may not be familiar with.
I think I've seen it.
Surveyed by Lieutenant Senator Rose, drawn by J. and Perry. Apparently the location of the river mouth was inaccurate, but it was used by the Congress for appropriations for harbor improvements. Now, just on the surface, you have field notes, and you have a rendering.
Right.
Someone that had never been, perhaps, to the site. And you have the same set of questions with all of this.
Exactly.
Field notes, map rendered, not necessarily by the on-site witnesses, but by somebody perhaps in Europe who's trying to figure out a visual image from a lot of notes and sketches.
Right. I think it's a great point. One of the nice things about the Jesuits is that there was a supply chain to see notes and maps go through the press It doesn't eliminate that problem, but it eliminates the elephants in the middle of Africa problem, or at least minimizes it. This is actually, it sounds weird to us, because I look at, you know, I want the story behind each map. I mean, I'm trained as, you know, as somebody with a historical sense. I want to know exactly what's going on. You know, I mean, who is actually sailing or canoeing up here? This is a pretty good representation of the island, but the orientation doesn't seem to be right, north and south. What's going on there? But one of the advantages of what computer science is called aggregated is this assumption, and it's not right, but it's one of the advantages of what they call big data, that errors will tend to cancel themselves out. That the more data you put in, you know, the less significant each individual error becomes.
But that regression that you put up on the wall
Yeah.
was insane, right? Because you like draw, I'm sorry, Bob.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's not mine, you know.
Whoever did it, right, is that there's quote unquote outliers all over the place, you
Yeah.
know, way out here. But there's a timeline that takes you from, I don't know, what was it like, from the 17th century up to the middle of the 19th century. And it's as if these points in 1800 are describing something as by the same epistemological structure as those in 1660, which of course is just nonsense, right? So why would somebody even develop a regression line like that?
Well, because...
I mean, unless they're all the same, right? Unless they're actually all trying to describe something that everybody has agreed on is what it is.
Well, this is based on, these are relative, not absolute values, number one. Secondly, they are trying to describe, quote unquote, the same thing. And again, we're dealing with a competitive industry in 17th century Europe. And map making is expensive. Copperplate map making is not something you do. You know, it's not like we're doing a paperback book. So we know that that these things, we thought that there may be, an outlier like this has just got to be, there's something wrong with the algorithm. This is why we dropped the ball segmentation algorithm. It's bouncing off another line. What these regression analyses show, at best, is a tendency to underrepresent the size of the lake by a slight amount at a particular time. This is only 40 maps. This is not our full data set. One of the things you can say is, is there a tendency here? This is what a regression analysis will tend to show you. Is there a tendency? Why would the maps be missing 1,000 square miles? And this is at a time.
Well, one half, at the beginning, you have terra incognita on half of the map. I mean, it's just kind of, you even showed us a map where they don't even bother with the western half of the lake because they actually don't know it. And so I'm confused.
Which one?
The crazy Lake Michigan map that you said was really good on the right side, and the left side is.
I mean, they're not even really drawing the right-hand side of the lake at this point. So it's
all of these were shapes. I'm not sure which. That one. Okay, this is not in the original. This is not part of the regression analysis.
I see.
Okay, good thing.
So in other words, because it doesn't fit the data, you're leaving it out? No,
we
sorry.
just the historian found this for us because this is the we don't look. It's 40 maps.
Right. No,
But-
I'm just teasing.
Yeah, no.
I really do see the value of it.
Yeah, the question is, if lakes are being underrepresented in size fairly consistently, what does that say about ice cover? That's the kind of critical question. The ice cover question is critical because, as somebody who didn't work in American, history, their expeditions after the Declaration of Independence, after the, where the Constitution is passed, to figure out what the hell is going on in New York State, because nobody's ever been there from the British. So, yeah, these are, I mean, this is comical, because, but, Gallané says, I didn't go here, I did go here. And you can see that that makes a certain kind of sense. He decides to go through Lake Erie. So I take your point, but we're not making any claims for that. That was a kind of how we got started and how we got to this shape segmentation, which we still has to be refined. I mean, anybody have $1 million of NSF money lying around, we'll be happy to take it off your hands.
Yeah, so Bob, I mean, I think what the questions are getting at, which I think, are in a way fairly the same kind of point from different angles, is that this is a really interesting project, both to show what a certain kind of digital humanities can do, and I think what it can't. And I think that, I guess maybe I would, and maybe everyone would encourage you to sort of, as you guys move forward, to delineate fairly carefully what they can and can't do. One problem, as you say, I mean, you're right, if you have a big enough data set, these kinds of errors do sort of disappear, average out.
At least mathematically.
Right, mathematically. You don't have, unfortunately, a huge data set. I mean, to really get them to
And I'm not representing California as an island.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well,
so that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would suggest is that you think, that I think would be great if this project moved towards a kind of crafting out a kind of methodology for digital humanities projects that could be a model that combined the hard, the sort of mathematical computer data analysis with the kind of metadata or historical annotations that people have talked about, because these are crucial. So either find ways to be publishing them both together, or because I don't think finally what you're going to end up in is, okay, if we know that this one was drawn by somebody but engraved by somebody else, and therefore there are going to be all these inaccuracies, and we don't have the drawn map, we only have the engraved map, we can't even find those. I don't think you're going to end up with something that's generated by computer alone. I think there's a lot of role for the humanist in this, and I think it's precisely by sort of being square or straight about the limitations as well as about the advantages of the project to be really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think though, look, this is getting funded through computer science. If you write a grant saying, I want to study maps of the Great Lakes before 1850, I mean, in the best, possible universe, NEH will give you $30,000 or something for a semester off. The interesting thing, a couple interesting things. First of all, we don't know what the full data set is of maps. How many maps were there of the Great Lakes available at the time? And available is kind of a key question because nobody's looking at a map from 1680 when they're engraving a map in 1820. Secondly, we're all over the humanist angle about this. I had to cut out all the passages from, individuals. The epistemological questions are critical ones. The epistemological questions have to be translated into terms computer scientists can give us computationally significant data for. That's the challenge. That's really the challenge. We publish articles on the methodologies of these grants. The humanist problem is one I think we can already, those of us in the humanities can see. We don't know about the chain of evidence of maps going back. We have to know about we have to know whether the Jesuits were on good terms with this tribe or that tribe. The French were aligned with various tribes at various points, various things.
The point I would just want to try to underscore and urge you to think about is no one is saying don't write the grants for the computer science, don't continue to do all that. Of course, do all that. But we had this conversation about distant reading and about the
Yeah.
derived projects, and about how claims about the
Right.
total number of words in a bunch of novels aren't necessarily claims about novels. In
Right.
other words, there's a big problem in digital humanities, especially where data comes in, of overclaiming
Right.
what's actually can be done or what's actually being found. And so I think this is such a great project because you can both find some things with data and you can very clearly
Yeah.
delineate limitations, and you could even suggest, as a result, a model moving forward that synthesizes the kinds of, running big data stuff that you want to do and then writing others want to do, with the kind of careful humanistic work.
Yeah. No, that's exactly that's what we're going with. I'm sorry, I keep getting one slide. With this format, rather than writing a DH format, because you can divide up chapters in various ways. I haven't had a chance to talk about animals and the fur trade, which is an extraordinarily complex issue. And I mean, clearly it tells us something about what a wildlife biologist would call the carrying capacity of the land. If you're suddenly going to Winnipeg and endangering your lives even more, you've got a critical problem. So we're not trying to, I think that the holy grail for us as a research team is can we give our climate model or something and say, we're going to change this pre-1850 value to that. That would be in one sense. From our point of view, though, it shows a kind
a
of
footnote in a climate model or something.
right. Or just we don't even need the footnote. We need the data set change. But the other thing is, from a humanistic point of view, it's precisely to show what you have to do to get the big data. This is not the big data. This is stuff in process. So this is like the rough draft, you have with, the three versions on your computer, and you can't remember which one is which, and their notes, and then you've scrawled on it, and that's where we're at.
Robert, I just want to say that this is a very interesting project. It pains my heart, though, that there's no geographer involved because we do cartography, GIS, and actually there is a really excellent group of scholars involved in critical cartography, critical GIS, who do exactly this kind of stuff, would I think be a wonderful addition to this team. So,
Just to go back, and I think you're absolutely right. So we have a geographer who keeps saying, well, I need more data, on this.
that's why you need a critical cartography, critical GIS.
We've looked around at Illinois. If you're volunteering, we'd love to have you. But our geographers are your geography group are all focused on modeling.
No, and that's why I'm saying there is
They're
a
all focused.
separate group.
We have no paleoclimatologists at Illinois, and we're one of the big climate centers in the country. It's modeling all the time.
In AG's library, we had Brian Harley, who was a critical cartographer and really established the tradition of critical cartography in geography.
Right.
I mean, that's what we're talking about, and unfortunately, you ran into the modelers in geography, but there are some of us who are not.
No, I realize there's some that are not modelers, but there's also a kind of, in terms of digital humanities, there's a question of how much time do you want to invest in this. I got a book due on March 1st. I have an article due before that, a completely different topic, on November 15th. How much time can you devote to this? And it's a great question. I mean, this is why I think this is one of the problems with big data. I mean, Moretti got somebody to do the computer programming from them, and then he's just making these kind of slapdash pronouncements. To me, the acid test is, can we ask questions we couldn't ask before? That's the only thing that I'm concerned about.
Actually, I think that's, I might disagree with you, actually, because I think almost the thing is, am I going to get a different answer than I didn't have before, right? Because and one of the things is that for historians, there was this moment, right, in the sort of mid-70s where people just got so excited about large amounts of quantitative data and what historians could actually do with it. And what would we do differently with this historical roles, with data from elections? And it has that feel right now, right, in digital humanities where we're finally going to know something. And I'm actually not sure whether I'm going to know something different from what I actually already know.
The project that Richard and I are discussing is people spend, these things are expensive to run, okay?
Right.
And I mean, part of my rationalization is because this is about climate and not novels, it's actually kind of, I can justify to myself that we're actually dumping more carbon into the atmosphere for a good purpose rather than tell us there's something there. All of the digital humanities and literature are saying, oh yes, the notion that poetic diction got simpler with the Romantics. You don't need that. You don't need that. And I've rejected for presses a couple of book manuscripts which subsequently got published, which are asking no new questions and providing no new answers. So I think you're right. I think at this stage, and again, we've had 2 preliminary grants to get to the proof of concept.
Right.
I think we do have something. It's early. We do have something here that's of interest that I think we can convince most geographers, most climatologists, there's actually something here in these maps.
Well, I think it's because of the islands and not the lake, right? Because the islands are sort of are historically so important, right? I mean, to know what they are in a way that the lake isn't, right? And so by focusing on the islands, it becomes really important.
The most climatologically sensitive regions.
Yep.
And so this becomes key. So thank you. These are great questions.
Take this upstairs.